Hi, I'm Chris. I collect vintage science fiction paperback books, and these are some of the gems that I've bagged in the second half of November of 2025. And many of these have come from the wonderful Dorset Bob, who I'm very lucky to live fairly close to. He's a book dealer, and I'll put his details in the blurb below. So do contact him with your wants, or if you want to arrange to go and view his stock, I'm sure he'd be happy to hear from you. So the first couple of books I've got to show are kind of difficult, perhaps controversial books. The first one being this fantastic edition of Barry Malzberg's The Destruction of the Temple. This is the New English Library version from 1975, originally published in 74, with this absolutely fantastic cover. Again, an unsung hero because we don't know who the illustrator is, but it's a beautiful cover. And the book is written in 74 but set in 2016, so kind of 50 years hence, and a couple of decades after what's called the Great Cataclysm, or the Great Burning of 1988, which kind of balkanized America and led to kind of urban areas and cities being destroyed and the sort of no-go areas. But in the book, the protagonist, who's a filmmaker, wants to go and make a film kind of reenacting the assassination of John F. Kennedy. Obviously, in 74, in the late 60s, early 70s, political assassination was a real thing. John F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X. So that's the kind of background, really, of this story. And in this story, it's kind of experimental new wave writing, and Malzberg kind of tells the story of the assassination over and over again. And the kind of reviews are kind of mixed. Some people suggest it's a classic of new wave science fiction. Others say it's very much of its time. The kind of experimental writing maybe doesn't work so well. So I very much wanted to read this book myself, and also to have this absolutely lovely edition. Similarly, with the next book is kind of controversial, difficult book, and that's this absolutely beautiful copy of Fugue for a Darkening Island by Christopher Priest. So again, this is an early 70s book written in 72, I think, and this is the Pan 78 version. Christopher Priest says he wanted to write a kind of post-apocalypse or a kind of social breakdown book in the kind of style of Wyndham, really, John Wyndham's Day of the Triffids. He also was watching at the time a lot of what was going on in Northern Ireland and Belfast, and wanted to bring some of that to English city streets. So in the story, there is general kind of social breakdown, and there's been a kind of limited nuclear war in Africa, and there's a mass exodus into Europe and to the UK, kind of. That's very controversial, very difficult. The inhabitants are trying to resist that. So lots of people suggest this is a very racist book. The refugees are treated very poorly, and the characters aren't very well written, and they're just kind of called Africans rather than from the various countries that Africa comprises. But other people say this kind of very misses the point. And Christopher Priest himself altered the text for a later edition, removing some paragraphs or passages and changing it. But absolutely, of course, denied it was a kind of racist tone. So I very much want to read it myself, and looking forward to it, and very happy to have this beautiful band lozenge edition, as we're learning to call it. Next, we jump back several decades, really to the early 20s, I suppose. This is The Metal Monster by Abraham Merritt. and was originally written stories serialized in the 1920s in magazines. But this book was first published in 1945, but this is the 1957 Avon edition with a wonderful, wonderful Richard Powers cover there. And the kind of reviews of this are, very, very positive. People saying it was a really interesting, well-written story, particularly for its time. And it's a kind of lost civilization story where some kind of adventurers in Asia discover a kind of lost continent, a lost civilization in Asia, where there are still Persians living and operating from hundreds of years, thousands of years before. But also there are what are called the metal monsters, either controlled by Nusrahallah, this kind of femme fatale figure, or are they controlling her? It's not quite clear. And the metal monsters, of course, perhaps we would call them kind of robots later on, but of course that word hadn't been invented in the 1920s or the 40s. But they strike me perhaps more as kind of Ian Banks kind of drones, really. They're kind of metal shapes, independent, autonomous, intelligent metal creatures that roam around and can attack with deadly force. So that's a kind of really interesting story from the 1920s stroke 1940s. And talking of Ian Banks, I've got picked up this absolutely beautiful edition of his The Bridge. This is the 1990 first US paperback edition from HarperCollins. The book originally was from the 1986, I think. And I have seen these about, but the kind of bright pink edging is often badly faded. But this is a really nice mint condition. And I read this book, The Bridge, when it came out many, many years ago. I'm a big Ian Banks fan. And in the story, the individual is driving a car but crashes within sight of the Firth of Forth Bridge and goes into a coma and wakes up on the bridge, a kind of never-ending bridge with no beginning or end, and occupied by various characters and communities. And he has kind of fantastical adventures, really. And it is actually a story that's on David Pringle's the best modern fantasies, these 100 best modern fantasies. And is a kind of really interesting story. And online, people kind of suggest that this is a link or a bridge, I suppose, between Ian Banks's science fiction stories, Ian Banks's science fiction stories, and Ian Banks's kind of modern literary fiction. So really pleased to have this. And that's a Peter Gadas cover, I should say. Next up, we have Human, ? An anthology from the 1950s, edited by Judy Merrill. And it's got a really good introduction by Frederick Brown as well, and wonderful cover, of course, by Ralph de Soto. So this is the Avon edition, the Lion Book edition from the early 50s, 1954. And it kind of raises the question, really, about what does being human mean? What does it mean when you encounter aliens? And there are a whole variety of stories in here. And each story has a kind of brief introduction by Judy Merrill. So that's a really lovely early 50s, late 40s, early 50s anthology of science fiction. Coming forward at least a couple of decades, we have this anthology by Norman Spinrad, The New Tomorrows, written in 1971, and I think this is the 72 Belmont edition. Should just check that. Yeah, Belmont Towers edition. It's got some really great stories by New Wave writers, and Norman Spinrad gives a real cri de coeur in the introduction, urging magazine editors to include new writers from the kind of New Wave. And it's a kind of really interesting introduction, kind of looking at SF writing and the kind of sales of SS books and magazines, but also his musing on the kind of, is it science fiction or speculative fiction debate. So a kind of really interesting kind of historic tone with some very good New Wave writers. As I say, Harlan Ellison, Sam Delaney, and Norman Spinrad himself, of course. But one of the interesting stories I noticed in here has perhaps one of the longest ever titles of a short story, The Circularization of Condensed Conventional Straight Lines and word images and structures. And the actual story itself sort of contains various kind of graphic representations of stories and writing in the story. So very New Wave, but a lovely edition to have. Next up, we have an Ursula Le Guin from 1980. This is the excuse me, 1982 Granada Panther edition of Threshold. A little bit sun faded there on the left hand side, as you can see, with the kind of Richard Clifton Day cover. And this is kind of similar to the kind of Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, really. It's some young people who go through a portal into a new world that immediately kind of, makes us think about Lion and the Witch and the Wardrobe. But my daughter, Beth, is a huge fan of Ursula Le Guin, and I asked her if she knew this book, and she did, and she said it was a very solid and interesting fantasy that she'd read and kind of recommended it. So we'll very much look forward to reading this at some point. Next, we have a Digit, Journey to the Centre of the Earth by Jules Verne, of course. So this is from the 1800s, 1884, I think, originally. But this is a kind of 1960 Digit. And a film tie-in, obviously, pictures of James Mason and Pat Boone there from the film. And I very much remember being a child, I don't know, 9, 10 or 11, watching this film on a Saturday afternoon and being absolutely enthralled about the fantastic story. I'm sure I don't need to tell you what it is, of the journey to the centre of the earth. So it's absolutely lovely to have this really good condition Digit movie tie-in edition. And I looked up on ISFDB and this edition isn't on there. So very happy I'll be able to add this onto the database. Next up, we have a couple of Cyril Kornbluth short story collections. This is A Mile Beyond the Moon from 1958. That's right. Yep. 1962 actually, and it's a McFadden book with a great Richard Powers cover there. And also I managed to pick up this lovely Ballantine classic science fiction edition of the best of C.M. Kornbluth, Cyril Kornbluth. And yeah, he obviously he was a kind of formidable writer. He wrote, along with Frederick Poole, Gladiator in Law and The Space Merchants, really classic early science fiction stories. But tragically, he died very young, 34, running apparently for a train. He had a heart attack. And Frederick Paul, who obviously kind of edits this volume of his best of, kind of worked very hard over the years to keep the memory of his stories and keep his friends and collaborators' fiction in the public eye. So lovely to have that. Next up is a Panther edition of The Holy City by Charles Finney. This is from 1986, I think. I should get that right. 1976, sorry, with a Peter Jones cover. And the kind of reviews for this online are underwhelming, to say the least. There's hardly anybody around to say a good thing about this book. The books are from the 1930s. As it says here, Charles Finney was the author of The Circus of Dr. Lao, which is, again, a classic book. I've got a kind of Penguin a copy of that, a kind of rare Penguin science fiction copy of this. But this was the follow-up, and I'm afraid to say it was kind of almost universally panned. But I saw this book, and who could resist? What a cover! I'm not a big fan of dinosaurs or monsters, but this is an absolutely brilliant cover by Peter Jones. And talking of brilliant covers, here's the best from fantasy and science fiction, this Ace 1968 edition of that. And obviously Fantasy and Science Fiction was a magazine, originally started published in the late 1940s and still going now. But they issued about 25 volumes of the best of, sort of covering kind of each year. And this is volume number 6. And yeah, so I do like to pick them up when I see them in good condition. And this is, you know, absolutely lovely condition. Look at that cover there. Edval Gorissi, I think it is. Yeah. What a brilliant cover from this 1968 Ace. Next up is a copy of The Furies by Keith Roberts. Now, I think in the last, a few videos ago, I showed an absolutely mint edition copy, Penguin copy of this book. But this is the kind of pan book from 1968. And the kind of edition that I have is almost too good to open. I know that sounds ridiculous, but it's nice to have a reading copy. And sometimes when I've got a really beautiful edition of a book, you know, it's almost as much fun to find a good reading copy so you can read it as well. And as you can see, I'm reading it at the moment. And it is a kind of apocalyptic story set in England, again in the tradition of Wyndham, where two nuclear tests, American and Russian nuclear tests, atmospheric tests, kind of crack open the Earth. And there are also giant wasps, as you can see by the brilliant cover by William Phillips. And the kind of wasps very much remind me of drone warfare, because the kind of protagonists at the moment are in armored vehicles and they keep getting attacked by what I've described as the 3-foot long deadly insects that make a kind of droning sound as they fly along, and are very lethal even to armored vehicles. So it's kind of very much, you know, these days you kind of think of that as kind of drone warfare. So really interesting story. I look forward to carrying on with that. So I always try and leave a couple of fantastic gems at the end, and no different from today. I've got 2 really nice books to finish off with. Here is this beautiful edition of Brian Aldiss's Hot House. It's the first UK paperback, Foursquare. And once again, look at that absolutely beautiful cover but again, an unsung hero. We don't know who the cover artist is. But this is from 1962, originally published in 62, but it's a 1964 four-square book. And again, this is a classic story which I haven't read. I'm kind of slightly ashamed to say, but very much looking forward to it. It's kind of set in the far distant future, kind of in a dying Earth. The sun is about to go nova, as it says on the back cover. And kind of flora, plant life has taken over the Earth, and humans are kind of relegated and are hunted by these carnivorous plants, trees, plants, in various things, and mosses and fungi. And humans are much reduced, not only in their status, but also in their height. They're much smaller. And it's also, very interestingly, for a 1962 book, a matrilineal society where women kind of lead. So really interesting story. Very much want to look forward to this. I read Brian Aldiss's Non-Stop, reread it this year. And so again, really looking forward to reading this. And then finally, another book. I keep saying looking forward to reading these books. Here is a beautiful edition of Keith Roberts' Molly Zero. I do already have a copy of this, but often you find that the spine is completely faded, as is the copy that I have. But this is an absolutely beautiful mint edition with David O'Connor as the cover artist, somebody I haven't heard of. And this is from 1985, this edition. And in the story, Molly is a young woman, post-apocalyptic future, being brought up in blocks, institutions, where you get decided whether you're going to be in the elite or in the kind of everyday hoi polloi, I suppose. And Molly is chosen for the elite, but escapes and goes on the run and has various adventures, and gets involved with the kind of revolutionary forces. So apparently there's kind of a number of twists in this, so I'm really looking forward to reading this. So those are some wonderful books I've picked up in the last couple of weeks or so. Again, those two beautiful books were from Dorset Bob. So again, as I say, I'll put his details below. So do contact him with your wants lists, or if you fancy going over and perusing his stock. Absolutely well worth it. So thank you very much, and see you again. Bye now.